Okay, well, thank you, Hank, for inviting me, and thanks to all of you and all of you. For me, the central question that we need to be asking is whether we should proceed with creating genetically modified human beings. That's the one that I think is important, and that's why there's all the fuss here. So from that point of view, it's really unsettling for me, instructive and unsettling for me to hear Lynn, you talking about it as a simple extension of IVF techniques. I don't see it that way. Yeah, so we'll talk about that more. Yeah. So I'm not going to address the mitochondrial issue very much, except to note that in the UK and in other countries, germline modification in human beings is against the law. That was settled some time ago. And the reason the UK Parliament had to vote on this particular procedure was it does modify the germline, and they had to carve out an exception in that rule. Because it is a germline procedure, we've been following it pretty closely at the Center for Genetics and Society for some time, and have real concerns about its safety and about the process in the UK and so on. But what I'm going to be talking about really is the questions around human germline modification, where we're at now, where we should be going or not going. And Hank, the instructions were to give some thoughts about ethics. So I thought I would start with some thoughts about what we mean by ethics. And the first thing I want to say about that is that I think we have to be careful that we do not collapse ethics to just mean safety or something being safe enough. I was really surprised I was on a PBS talk show last week or the week before with a Nobel Prize-winning geneticist who said flatly, if we can improve the safety, he was talking about CRISPR gene editing, if we can improve the safety, then that takes care of the ethical concerns. I don't see it that way at all. Safety, of course, is huge, paramount, but it's hardly the whole picture. The other thing that I think we have to be careful about when we're talking about ethics is not to collapse it just to questions of individual consent. Like safety, informed consent is important. When we're talking about modifying the genes that we pass down to our children that would affect every cell in the bodies of those children and their descendants, informed consent is a bit of a challenge, even if you think parents are okay to make those decisions for their children. There's no precedent for them making those kinds of decisions about their grandchildren and future generations. But that aside, to think about ethics just as consent is just wildly insufficient when it comes to assessing the prospect of genetically modified human beings. Some people have called human germline modification, or actually germline modification in general, a species-altering technology. And I think it's also pretty likely to be a society-altering technology. And that's why I think we need a much broader ethical focus. We really need to take a careful look at the social dynamics that introducing human germline modification would likely set in motion, and that includes the commercial dynamics that it would set in motion. Those are not the kind of risks that are easily quantified, but they are nonetheless very real, and I think we have to really anticipate them very carefully and thoughtfully. When you think about that, the worst case scenarios are actually pretty horrific, and these are the worst case scenarios, and we have to assess how likely they are. So what are they? A genetic arms race between nations, within countries, a world in which affluent parents purchase the latest set of upgrades for their offspring, leading to the emergence of genetic haves and have-nots. This is the scenario that a Princeton molecular biologist called the gen-rich and the naturals. And part of his speculation was writing ad copy for a fertility clinic of the future, and he called their services organic enhancement, and the ad copy went, keep in mind, you must act before you get pregnant. Don't be sorry after she's born. This really is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for your child to be. So this is the kind of vision of the future that this guy actually seemed to be endorsing. He wasn't doing this as in a cautionary mode. So many people, of course, don't want to go there. They would like to avoid that kind of scenario that could be caused by the emergence of genetic castes, the idea that wealthy people will buy these upgrades for their children. They don't want to embrace that, but they do want to embrace the idea that we should be using germline gene editing for medical purposes. And of course, we all want healthy babies, and we want to help people have healthy babies. But here's a really key point. As you referred to, Lynn, we don't need germline modification in most cases, in almost all cases really, to prevent the transmission of inheritable diseases because of the embryo screening technique that Lynn described. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is what it's known as, PGD. And that can provide an unaffected, a healthy and fully genetically related child for a couple that is at risk of passing on a genetic disease. And it would also eliminate that mutation from the family lineage. And it's not risk-free, and it's not ethics-free, as you mentioned, especially from a disability rights point of view. It's far less socially and ethically fraught and far safer than mucking around in the human germline, to use the technical term. So then you have to ask, okay, if you can use PGD for preventing the cystic fibrosis, the Tay-Sachs kinds of diseases, why not use these new gene editing techniques to engineer people with what you might call medical enhancements? So, for example, to give a future child, swap in a gene variant that would provide immune resistance to HIV. But think about where that takes us. The line between medical and therapeutic traits on the one hand and enhancement or cosmetic traits on the other hand is impossibly blurry. That's inherent in the logic of it. So that would leave us with no way to define a meaningful line between different purposes, and therefore no possibility of really establishing or let alone holding a policy line. And when you think again about the real world of social dynamics, of commercial dynamics, you're a couple, you've already invested in the genetic upgrade to give your child immunity to AIDS. Well then, why not throw in a few dozen genetic variants that we think might boost her IQ too? No additional cost, no additional risk. Then you have the child, she grows up, and she gets her high SAT scores, and how do we know? Is it because of the genetic upgrade, or is it because of the high-end private school? Wouldn't that kind of situation make it pretty likely that we would start to think about some people really being genetically superior, biologically superior to others? And then what? So now some observers, and Hank is one of these, point out correctly, of course, that these kind of traits that would make our children qualify as designer babies, the higher intelligence, the perfect pitch, and so on, that these are extraordinarily complex. They're multifactorial even just in terms of genes. They interact constantly with the rest of the biological and social environment and so on, and that's all true. And for some people, the conclusion, therefore, is we don't have to worry. And I have to say, I do take some comfort in the thought that these designer baby scenarios may remain beyond technical reach. But then I think about the glow-in-the-dark monkeys, about the transgenic mice that run the mazes faster and more accurately than their natural counterparts. And I think about the commercial forces and competitive dynamics that might make parents in affluent communities like this one feel that they were being irresponsible to deny their child the best start in life, the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So these questions, all this kind of thinking about, is there a medical argument? What would be the social consequences? These are not new. They've been under discussion for decades. And back in the 1990s and early 2000s, these questions were actually hashed out in a lot of places around the world, and a lot of jurisdictions in more than 40 countries decided that this was a no-brainer, really, for most of them. It was not going to be done. They passed laws. Those laws are still on the books that encourage using all kinds of gene transfer techniques for medical purposes to help people who are sick, and prohibit using them to modify the human germline. There are also this is the law. Not these 40 countries. These are scientifically advanced countries, the ones with the biotech sectors. And there are also a couple of international documents, including a Council of Europe treaty that prohibits human germline modification, just puts it off limits. these laws and these treaties, they draw a very clear and very practical line between somatic gene transfer, as it's called, and germline interventions. They see one as an effort to treat people who are sick and that these techniques should be strongly supported, and they see germline as an effort to breed superior people, and we shouldn't go there. And I very much in sympathy with that point of view. So the medical argument for human germline modification is tenuous because we have other techniques to prevent inherited disease. And the temptation to try to enhance future generations, I believe, is profoundly dangerous. Down that road, our scientific achievements are all too likely to become not instruments of enlightenment and emancipation, but instead to become mechanisms for exacerbating inequality. Down that road, our desire to improve the human condition, which I think we all share, leads us away from the social and political changes that we know are needed to provide, that we we need to provide people with clean air, good food, basic health care. And instead, our wonderful technical and scientific capacities all too easily wind up actually fostering some of the least attractive tendencies of our time. And I would number among those techno-scientific curiosity that is unbounded by care for social consequences, also hopes for our children that are wrought into consumerism, and another I'll mention is a deep denial of our own mortality. So I think it's something not to be done. And just one last observation. We often hear that human germline modification is inevitable, and I think that's just not true. Societies make decisions all the time about the rules of the road, which ones they're going to enforce, and they change. Human societies haven't always outlawed slavery. Human societies haven't always outlawed murder. And in fact, in 2015, there's still murder in the world, and there is still slavery in the world. But we would be living in a very different world if laws against murder and laws against slavery didn't exist. And we're likely to find ourselves in a very different world depending on what we decide about how to use the powerful genetic tools that are now being refined.
Thank you, Marcy.